Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Agustina Giraudy. I am an associate professor at the School of International Service at American University. Welcome to this event on democratic backsliding below the national state, the US in comparative perspective. Before kicking the event off, I wanted to thank Kay Summers for helping me organize this event. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the logistics for today's conversation. The discussion will last for approximately 45 minutes with 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the session. If you want to ask questions, we please ask you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of our screens. And if you need to enable your closed captioning function, please do so by also clicking the button at the bottom of the screen. We please ask you that no one record the session. We will be recording it for you, and it will be available on the SIS YouTube channel. So just to start our conversation today, I wanted to say very few words about the process of democratic backsliding. As you all know, we currently live in a process, in an era of democratic backsliding. This process is affecting both countries in the global north and the global south. And while the main focus of this conversation has always been what happens at the national level, scholars of subnational politics have long recognized that this process of democratic erosion also takes place at the subnational level. So what we will do today is talk more about what's going on at the subnational level in the US, but we will keep an eye on processes of democratic erosion in other parts of the world. So we're gonna actually bring in some of the knowledge that comparativists have produced over the course of several decades. And today I have the pleasure of having three fantastic scholars and researchers who are doing important work in this area. Our first speaker is Charlotte Hill. She's a political scientist and researcher at UC Berkeley. Her research explores how structural reforms might improve American democracy, especially for the types of people who have been historically shut out of that process. Our second speaker is Caroline Gallagher, a colleague of mine, a professor at SIS at American University. She studies the internal dynamics and patterns of violence of militias, paramilitaries, and private military contractors, among other groups. And her research has focused on Ireland, Mexico, and the US. And finally, I have Ken Eaton, who is a professor of politics at UC Santa Cruz, and he specializes in Latin American politics. His research in particular explores how territorial interests and identities impact political outcomes, in particular democracy. So with these introductions, I'd like to start our conversation. And the first thing that I would like to do is talk about what is arguably the most important institution of a democratic regime, which is the right to vote. And so, Charlotte, I wanted to ask you if you could please tell us what are the new efforts to suppress voters, especially young voters here in the United States, and which factors impact whether they are successful at driving down turnout.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thanks for having me here. Well, I doubt it's news to anyone joining us in this conversation that voter suppression is alive and well here in the United States. And perhaps the most frequent and well-documented type of voter suppression here is suppression that targets people of color, primarily and historically Black voters, also increasingly Hispanic voters. And unlike, I would say, suppression of generations past, today's suppression is often more subtle or more easily framed as a means of enhancing election security, but it has the same effect of imposing disproportionate costs or burdens on particular groups in order to make it harder for them to participate. So my own research focuses on suppression that affects young people, and I divide that suppression into two types. There's suppression that targets, that's primarily targeted at young adults, and then suppression that's more broadly targeted, but that sweeps up young people along with other groups. And it's primarily at this point enacted by the Republican Party. Perhaps I could say exclusively at this point, presumably because young people on the whole support Democratic candidates and have more liberal policy preferences. And also young people are disproportionately people of color in the US, so there's an intersectionality at play. And before I talk through specific examples of what that suppression looks like, I do think it's important to pause and say why, youth-targeted voter suppression matters, why I have spent a lot of time studying it. First, it biases election results. We can think about the types of candidates that young people have preferred at the federal level in the last couple presidential election cycles, both in 2016 and 2020. Young people preferred Bernie Sanders to Hillary Clinton and later to Joe Biden by pretty large margins, even if they eventually came around and did support those more centrist or mainstream candidates in the general elections. Suppression biases policymaking. Young people are disproportionately likely to prioritize certain policies in comparison to older folks. So for instance, right now, we know that young people are prioritizing improving the educational system, improving the job situation in the country, and protecting the environment. Those are three top concerns for young people, and they tend to prioritize them. There will be 10 or sometimes even 20 percentage point gaps in terms of how many young people prioritize those policies compared to, say, people 60 or 65 and older. The suppression also, it impacts future participation because, at least in the US, although I believe this is often the case in other countries as well, whether young people vote in an election really does predict whether they will keep participating in future elections. So even if you don't fully shut someone out of the electoral process by disenfranchising them, if you can make it hard enough for them to participate at an early age, it can then impact whether they participate in elections to come. And finally, it impacts public trust in elections and government and democracy. And we have seen some concerning statistics in recent years of young people in the US not only feeling low trust, having low trust and confidence in US elections and in US government, but in the entire conception of democracy. So all that being said, what does the suppression look like when it's targeted at young people? It often focuses on college students. So in recent years, we've seen campus polling place closures that require young people to travel farther distances in order to vote. We've seen redistricting of electoral districts that will literally divide college campuses in half, so that some students, depending on which dorm they live in, might be voting in one district for one set of candidates, and other students are voting in another district. And have totally different polling places as well. We see voter ID laws that explicitly prevent the use of college student IDs as a valid form of identification for voting, or that require, I think this was the case in Ohio's latest voter suppression bill, bills that require in-state driver's licenses in order to vote. And we know that young people who move for college often lack that in-state driver's license. We also see age restrictions around things like vote by mail. This was the case in Texas during the 2020 election, when everybody was turning to mail voting in order to avoid getting sick at the polls from COVID. And in Texas, they specifically said, if you're 65 and older, you're allowed to vote by mail without providing a valid excuse. But if you're younger, you won't have access to that option. I want to make sure that I'm not going over time. I can talk about other types of suppression that affect young people too, but I do want to share something that my research has found in terms of, the second part of your question of which factors shape whether these efforts are successful. It really does seem that how well organized young people are at getting attention for certain suppressive efforts does matter for whether whether young people are effective at blocking those efforts or overturning them. There was a legal team that recently was able to file and win a lawsuit to ensure that Vassar College students had an on-campus polling place, which is wonderful. It's great that they were able, I think, to block that, the effort to eliminate that polling place, but it's also not something that most students, and especially in less populated or less educated or less kind of salient media environments, are going to be able to do. It also seems to be the case that when it comes to suppression that targets people of color, particularly Black and Hispanic voters, we have research suggesting that there can be a backlash effect where those groups feel angry and that mobilizes them and they exert extra effort to come out to the polls. My research examined whether this happens for young people as well. And what I found via some survey experiments is that while learning that suppression is targeting young people can increase young people's knowledge of that suppression. It increases their anger about the suppression. It increases what we call psychological reactance, which is this negative emotional response in reaction to feeling that someone is taking away your right or your freedoms. That didn't translate into increased intentions to vote in future elections. And what did seem to matter, what was interesting to me was that young people who strongly identified with their age group, for young people for whom being young was a strong part of their identity, hearing about youth-targeted voter suppression did impact whether they intended to vote in future elections. But that's not a strongly held identity for most young people. It's different from what we see with measures of people's responses to surveys where we ask about their racial identity, for instance. Young people do tend to strongly identify with their racial identity, and then if they hear about suppression targeting Black people, targeting Hispanic people, and they belong to that group, that does mobilize them. But we're not seeing that with young people. So in terms of future efforts to respond to youth-targeted voter suppression, I'm very interested to see what will happen if groups can intentionally try to build up that youth group identity and see if that can help lead to some counter mobilization. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Charlotte. So I would like now to focus a little bit on the non-electoral aspect of democratic backsliding in the US. And I would like to ask Carol, what do we know about other anti-democratic groups and how are they operating in the US? Where do we see them operating?
So I think I would start by saying, and you didn't ask this question exactly, but I think like the question is sort of who is doing this? And I think right now where we're seeing pushes against democracy are by groups on the far right. And I also think it's important to like outline what I mean by the far right. So the far right can compose a constellation of different groups, and I'll talk about what they are in a second, but I think there are a couple of key factors that make a group, far right. One of those is a belief that inequality is natural and right. They also tend to believe, therefore, that the status quo is worthy of defending because the status quo is often based on inequalities, right? There's a social and economic hierarchy there. And so they want to defend those hierarchies. Because government, especially after the Great Society and after FDR's presidency, government was often involved in trying to right some of those wrongs. They're also very suspicious of the government itself. The government is often the enemy of far-right groups, although we have seen a change recently around Trump, where all of a sudden far-right groups that have been historically very anti-government were all of a sudden more than happy to put aside their anti-government bona fides to support him. But again, normally the discourse is that government is the enemy. And also anti-Semitism is a core and central function of far-right groups. And so you see this sometimes in conspiracy theories about, like, if an election is being quote unquote stolen, the larger underlying trajectory there in terms of the storyline is that it's Jewish people that are doing that. So that's kind of the larger framework of the ideology of the groups that are involved in, I think, democratic backsliding in political and non-specifically political electoral ways. So I think now it's kind of important to think about, well, okay, who are these groups, right? And as someone who studied the far right for a long time, it's easy, especially sitting in Washington, D.C., to go, oh, well, they're all just one big group and they have parties together and they sit around and, rub their hands together and are thinking about their strategies and all. But actually the far right is quite divided and there are a lot of different groups. I tend to think of three big categories of far right groups: white supremacists and their sub-movements. So this would be neo-Nazis, racist skinheads, the alt-right, traditional far-right groups like the Klan as well. a second kind of category, or what we would call anti-government groups. This would be groups like militias and sovereign citizens. And then you have more single issue groups like anti-abortion, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim groups. And then kind of on the adjacent side of that, you have groups like Christian nationalists and the Tea Party. One of the things that we've seen leading up to, but certainly amplified and magnified during the Trump administration, was that all of these groups kind of started, the lines between them used to be pretty rigid, and there's a lot more blurriness between the lines. It's not that there was never blurriness there, but it's more blurry and more willingness to cooperate. I mean, one thing that's very common on the far right is that you have all these internal feuds inside of groups, between groups, and they've been more willing to cooperate and act together around particular goals. So one of the things that I'm looking at right now in my research is the concept I'm calling county capture. And I'm actually taking this concept from literature on drug trafficking and also things that have happened in post-Soviet satellites, at post-communist states. But I'm reframing it for what we're seeing on the ground with far-right groups that are trying to take over in some form or fashion the basic levels and levers of democracy. So they're involved in the political process, but they're not always involved just in electoral politics. They're often supporting candidates for office, or they're showing up at city council or county council meetings, making threatening statements. Sometimes they have been accused of and found guilty of harassing or threatening people on city councils or county councils or boards of supervisors. They're also undemocratic in a very democratic erosion kind of way, which is that they're using the democratic process for undemocratic ends, right? So like they finally, after years of like the government is the enemy, we want to blow it up. The government is where they're actually, making the inroads into trying to bring in undemocratic sort of things. But they're not interested in governing. They're interested mostly in tearing things down. And again, what they focus on when they're talking about tearing things down is tearing down checks and balances that protect against, the sort of notion of the tyranny of the majority. So elections are involved in that. They will get involved in elections when it has to do with like Donald Trump, for example. But they will also, they're not interested in like building something in its place. They're literally trying to tear down the various things that make democracy work. And again, that's more than just elections. It's protection of minority rights. It's the ability to have dissent and express that, all sorts of things that go along with that. There's also, again, and this is very consistent with the far right, a push for local control, which is why finally they were like, okay, let's focus on government, but we're going to do what we've always focused on things, which is at the local level. And I think this, for me, as a person that studies far right groups and paramilitaries, the biggest thing that they are doing, I think, and it's really important to look at, is they are bringing paramilitarization into the mainstream. So they're not looking like most paramilitaries. You think about the AUC in Colombia or the Loyalists in Northern Ireland or other places. They don't want to be brought into government, but they want to have government, kind of a government stamp of approval. They like to have that informal relationship. And so they're very interested, if you're thinking about anti-democracy, in getting the legitimacy and the maneuverability to do what they want to do with no checks and balances. And so this is one of the big problems that we're seeing with these groups is they are interacting with governments and governments are interacting with them. And again, at the county level, but like all places where you have paramilitaries active, this creates all kinds of problems, right? Because then you're like, okay, well, is this a police officer or is this a local person in the paramilitary? Who's in control here? What do I do? And so they're actually, in a sense, doing what we've studied in other places. I've studied in other places for a long time. They are becoming a quasi formal force, but again, with that plausible deniability for the state and also their room for maneuverability. So I think what we're seeing there is kind of this combination of using the levers of the state at the county level for undemocratic means. And one of the undemocratic means is by being a paramilitary, having no checks and balances, having no constituency that you owe to. And so they can wreak a lot of havoc. And I can go into, later on in the, if you want, in the talk about sort of some of the specific ways they're doing this.
Thank you, Carol. So I would like to put the US in comparative perspective now and invite Kent to tell us a little bit about what do we know about processes of democratic erosion at the subnational level outside of the US.
Thanks, Agustina. I think the first thing I would say, and it sort of relates to the focus of Professor Hill's research on voter suppression, is that when we look at the subnational level and we kind of shift to the subnational from the national level, the same kind of two dimensions, the classic dimensions of democracy, contestation, and participation, are still really relevant, right? And so in the U.S. case, we know that subnational authoritarian regimes both focused on voter suppression, so literacy tests, poll taxes, now ID laws, as well as limiting contestation through what was the white primary, now it's gerrymandering. In Latin America, at least, and in contrast, I think subnational authoritarian regimes have really focused on contestation and not participation. And so this kind of curious feature, I think we need to examine it and explore it a little bit more. But typically what subnational undemocratic regimes look like is a single hegemonic party or a family clan, kind of deeply entrenched in the province of the country, and kind of using its tools to suppress, to co-opt, to undermine an opposition party from emerging and winning. And so these kind of entrenched authoritarian governors, in Argentina and Mexico, a little less so in Brazil, but much less in the way of sort of explicit or implicit attempts to disenfranchise voters. And so in some ways, the comparison, when we bring the Latin America into this comparison, it really underscores, I think, the very dramatic, nature of the erosion that's happening in the United States, which is focusing on the participation side and not just the contestation side. So that's worrisome. I think it's really tied to this important distinction that, unlike any federal case I've studied, including, the Latin American cases, only in the United States do the states control not just state elections, but federal elections. And so that's a unique feature of our federal case. And so in some ways, the threat is even more dire that, in other words, authoritarian governors in Argentina and Mexico, they could try to suppress participation and voter participation in the provinces. They're really not doing that. They're focusing on contestation and trying to suppress opposition. But even if they wanted to, they couldn't, affect national elections because they simply do not control national elections. So, and in some ways, listening to both Professors Hill and Gallagher, there's a less obvious ideological pattern. This is not just a right-wing phenomena in Latin America, and perhaps this is because the focus is on suppressing contestation and not participation. So I could give you examples of, autocratic governors who might actually be to the left on some issues relative to the national parties to which they belong. And so it's not tracking as neatly kind of along ideologically. We can kind of think more about that. I think the second thing I'd mention is, what have we learned about SURs, subnational undemocratic regimes elsewhere, is that they can be remarkably resilient. And so, I think the early assumption was that the transition to democracy at the national level, which took place in Latin America in the 80s and 90s, as late as 2000 in Mexico, this is the so-called third wave of democracy, that it would eventually, but inevitably, kind of trickle down and translate into regime change in a democratic direction at the subnational level, and that undemocratic regimes kind of wouldn't or couldn't last long. They were sort of anomalous. And I think, as time has gone on, and as we've studied this kind of more directly, we're seeing that's not the case. And in some ways, it just reflected this kind of methodological nationalism that, really plagues my discipline, political science, where we kind of obsess about and, privilege the national level and just assume that the subnational level is not really a separate sphere, or that it's just going to track onto, national level dynamics. And that's clearly not the case. And so the concept we might even use to think of this as regime juxtaposition, where you could actually see quite stable patterns in which, today we're talking about a national democratic regime in a country with subnational undemocratic regimes. The flip side could also obtain, where you could have an authoritarian regime at the national level, but pockets of or kind of spaces of, democratic action at the subnational level. But that this can actually be quite stable, and that we shouldn't assume that regimes are going to align between the national. So I think so I think we're learning a lot about resilience and of these regimes. And then I would think the last thing I would say, and I think we're learning this a lot, from the Latin American cases, and these have been the most heavily studied. There's emerging literature on India and Russia as well, although given kind of shifts in an authoritarian direction at the national level, those cases are a little bit different. But a big literature now in Latin America, and sort of interesting to kind of think about some mechanisms that how are these authoritarian governors surviving? And so I just wanted to mention kind of three, I think, interesting hypotheses really about what might explain the persistence of, in some ways, surprising persistence of governors who are quite authoritarian. And so one pattern is kind of a political economy argument is really that provinces thrive on, or provinces that depend, heavily on fiscal transfers from the center. Typically, this is, automatic revenue sharing, are more likely to have authoritarian regimes. So the argument is basically, transfers from the federal government undermine the democratic connection between a governor and their constituents, and sort of the need to extract resources historically is generated from more representativeness. This is an old argument. This is sort of the Magna Carta argument that democracy comes about through the need to obtain resources locally, revenues locally. And so fiscal transfers cut that, and that might be one worrisome kind of dynamic that sets in motion authoritarian practices. I think another pattern has to do with the bureaucracy, and here we've learned a lot from Professor Giraudy's work on how autocratic governors basically use provincial level bureaucracies as the tool to perpetuate themselves in power. This is particularly likely in poorer, more rural, less economically vibrant provinces where many or maybe most workers could be employed by the provincial bureaucracy, and so that gives the governor really the ability to use patronage to stay in power. And then the last thing I'll say just is this notion of boundary control, which is a concept Ed Gibson has given us, that basically subnational autocrats survive if they can keep the conflict local. They can win if they can keep it local. And so authoritarian governors have an easier time kind of suppressing local opposition if they can keep out the feds. And that's a Latin American pattern. There's certainly, that's the US case of the feds finally showing up in the 50s and 60s to end the Solid South and to end Jim Crow. And so there's some thoughts about what we're learning from other parts of the world, I think.
Thank you, Kent. And so I would like to go back to the US and to the electoral dimension of the democratic backsliding process. And I wanted to ask Charlotte about the ongoing election subversion efforts that exist, and which are the factors that predict the passage of election subversion legislation. If you can share with us some of the findings of your research.
Sure, happy to. And I think it's even if we're going back to the US, I think there's, I'm struck by a lot of things that Ken was just sharing, and how really something we're talking about here is that actors who want to secure and maintain their power will work within the bounds of their system to find the best ways to do that, right? But often the kind of fundamental intention is the same, and that's relevant to the question of which states and which types of actors are focusing on election subversion in the US versus, for instance, voter suppression. So election subversion was a hot topic going into the midterms last year. It was a hot topic in the 2020 election cycle in the US. But in the midterms, we had election deniers, candidates who claimed that Joe Biden had not in fact won the 2020 election, or candidates who were unwilling to make an affirmative statement that Biden was the real winner. We had election deniers running for statewide election offices in a number of key swing states. And the concern was that if they won, Donald Trump and the Republican Party would be better positioned to ensure Trump's victory in 2024, even if voters, in fact, preferred Joe Biden. And then all of the swing state election deniers lost their races. And so I think election subversion has, for that reason, really kind of dropped out of the national conversation about US democracy and major threats to democracy. But experts who study this are still really concerned. So I'll start by defining some terms again here. So subversion is, and there's not really a clear universally agreed upon definition of subversion among American democracy scholars, but my take is that subversion is any activity that is taken after votes are cast to ensure that a particular candidate wins despite the expressed will of voters. So subversion bills can pass before an election if what they're doing is enabling subversion activities that will be taken after votes are cast. I apologize, my cat is meowing in the background. So broadly speaking, there are three paths to subversion. The first is that partisan actors can take over key aspects of the election administration process. They can manipulate election rules and vote totals. And that's what my research is focusing on. A second path, and this got more attention, I'd say, around the 2020 presidential election, was that policymakers can use technical legal arguments to give themselves the authority to overturn election results. These were some of the conversations we were hearing about around states perhaps sending Congress alternate slates of electors, the vice president refusing to certify national election results, and so on. And the third path to subversion is violence and intimidation that can be used to disrupt the free and fair administration of elections and the counting of ballots. And we did see this after, we've seen this in several recent federal election cycles. I don't believe I heard about it in 2022, but in 2020 and perhaps 2018 as well, protesters surrounding locations where votes were being counted, refusing to let election workers in and out of buildings, threats that, of course, the most famous, the storming of the Capitol in an effort to interfere with the certification of federal election results. So my co-author, Jake Grumbach at the University of Washington, and I have a working paper that focuses on that first path to subversion, the partisan actors taking over aspects of election administration and empowering themselves to potentially manipulate election rules and vote totals. And we were interested in the predictors of election subversion bills being passed. What predicts whether a state adopts one of these subversion bills? And what we find is interesting. So perhaps unsurprisingly, Republican control of state legislatures matters. And the closeness of the 2020 presidential election is associated with a state passing a subversion policy. So those are perhaps not as surprising. Subversion, you have more of an incentive to pass a bill like this if you think that maybe changing a few votes could matter for who wins an election. If the Democrats are winning by a landslide, it might be harder for you to subvert election results. But the more surprising thing is that these subversion policies, and we're looking at bills passed in 2021 and 2022 when we've seen this whole a real influx of some of this legislation in state legislatures. These post-2020 subversion policies are mostly unrelated to the extreme gerrymandering and voter suppression policies of the 2010s. At first, we were a little surprised to see this. We thought maybe the same actors would be passing all of these different types of legislation, but then when we stopped and thought about it, it made sense. Because subversion is really only necessary to ensure that your party gains and maintains power if other approaches to biasing elections that occur earlier in the election process, like suppression, aren't already in place. Moving forward, the reason that we're still focusing on subversion, even when it has dropped a bit from the national agenda, is that there are still a few key states where there is a high I won't necessarily say a high likelihood of election subversion, but where there's a high risk of these bills being passed and then impacting state and federal election results. So these are states where the executive branch leaders, governors, secretaries of state, attorneys general, are more likely to engage in election subversion, and where the legislature is more likely to pass laws that increase the risk of subversion. There's a really great report out from a collection of organizations, States United, Protect Democracy, and Law Forward, and they identified 3 states that meet those criteria. So it's Florida, North Carolina, and Texas. And then there are a number of states that, additional states that meet at least one of those criteria. And of course, in 2024 and beyond, it's a chamber can flip toward election deniers and potential election subverters. Someone who supports subversion legislation can win a key statewide race and such. So we're never truly safe from that threat. And I really, I would encourage any scholars who are listening to this conversation to think about researching this more, because it's really under-researched in the U.S. context. I think it'd be very helpful to know more about historical efforts on this front. It'd be very helpful to have more comparative research on this front. Yeah, I'll pause there. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlotte. So turning back to the non-electoral aspect of the process of democratic backsliding in the U.S., Carol, can you walk us through some of the main tactics that these non-democratic groups, call them paramilitaries, militias, the name that you want to call them, are using?
Sure. Well, I will start and say that in terms of what I'm seeing on the ground right now, the 3 biggest kind of groups that are doing this are constitutional sheriffs, who are actually elected officials themselves, county militias, and then sort of freelance groups that may have a leg in another group, but they create kind of a quick or fast group, or they start advocating on a particular issue, not under their other group's hat, and then they sort of form a new group. And what I think, if we're looking at sort of how this works tactically wise, I think it's good to think about mechanisms, because there are a lot of specific tactics in a mechanism or a pathway. What I'm seeing among this group of social movement actors are a couple of things. One is political involvement, but again, not explicitly only about elections. And so, you're seeing militia groups getting behind particular candidates at the county level. You're also seeing them participating in county government in the way they hadn't before, by showing up to county council meetings, making threats. I'll give you one example of this. In Shasta County, California, a couple of years ago, a local militia group there spurred a recall election of a centrist Republican county supervisor. And they while that was going on, they threatened other board supervisors, and they bullied city employees that weren't elected officials, like the CFO of the county, the director of health and human services, who was running the sort of COVID response at the time. Again, all of this stuff, except for the threats, was legal. And so they were just getting involved, and they were making county government hard to do, again, at the brass tacks level of what you have to do. The other way I'm seeing this is what I call broadly recognition. And this is where you find counties and militias coming together to get a formal agreement in writing, even if it's not legal, a formal agreement in writing that we're gonna recognize this militia. I'm working on a project right now looking at 4 counties in Virginia: Halifax, Franklin, Bedford, and Campbell. My dad was from Bedford County. My mom was from Pittsylvania County, and I grew up in Campbell County. So I'm like familiar with all these counties. And what they have done is they have formally, through resolutions, recognized these militias. So it's a formal recognition. Now, I've talked to the folks over at the Georgetown Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, and they tell me that this is actually illegal, in the sense that these militias cannot actually operate independently, because Virginia Constitution says the only entity that can actually call up a militia is the governor. So unless Youngkin does this, these resolutions don't have teeth. They're purely performative. But I would argue they're a bit more than performative, because what you're doing is legitimizing these actors. And the big question, and then I'll go into a little bit more about the resolutions they've passed, is the potentiality for paramilitarization. And you see this in some of the debates that these county supervisors were happening. 3 of the counties passed a resolution, Halifax didn't. how they debate this, like how are they understanding this? And the people that dissent in Bedford County, for example, even though Bedford passed, it was like, well, what happens if they go off the rails? Like, is there legal risk for us? The other way to think about that too, beyond a risk to a county government, is what about the people that live in that county? If you are going to deputize, for example, militia members, but you can't fire them, right? You can't discipline them. So again, this is a classic problem when you have non-state actors forming or acting as sort of police. I'll also say, if we look at the resolutions in Virginia, there's definitely a coordinated effort to do this across these counties. So these counties range from the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains into what will be former tobacco country. So they're pretty close by to one another, but they're kind of different. They have different histories and political economies. But one group coordinated these resolutions, and one of the ways you can tell is they're virtually identical. I mean, they changed the name of the county, and that's about it. That group is called the Virginia Citizens Defense League. It also, one of the things I noticed when I was looking at these county minutes was these resolutions would just appear. There would be a vote, and in some of the counties there was no discussion. Like there was no opposition there to speak about it. And talking to Mary McCord again at the Georgetown Institute, what she suggests, and is, we need to dig into this, and I'm hoping to do that more, is that clearly some of these groups, these county militias, like the Campbell County Militia or the Bedford Militia, are working with supervisors to put these resolutions on, up for a vote without any prior notification. So there's nobody has a chance to speak out about it. That hasn't happened in all the counties, but it has. So what do these resolutions do? They recognize the right of militias to exist. Typically, the way the state constitution has been sort of thought of is that the state National Guard is the militia. But if it were going to call up another group, it wouldn't be calling up a group with the name and like a 501(c) if they get that far with it. They're calling up able-bodied men normally. So recognizing their rights says, hey, these guys are like, the civic association down the road. It recognizes their right to muster and train. It also recognizes their right to use any available legal firearms and to have no restrictions on the firearms. And it also promises to allow these groups to prevent the quote unquote unconstitutional application of federal and state laws. And other than that, these resolutions all don't have is any check. There's nothing in these resolutions that say, this is what we will do if you go beyond the parameters of action. So this is kind of the way I look at this, is the potential boiling up of a potential, like there's this group over here, they could be pulled into behavior that looks very much like paramilitaries in Chiapas in Mexico, in Colombia, in Northern Ireland, where they are de facto, if illegal government doing in terms of the law enforcement.
Thank you, Carol. And so finally, I would like to close our discussion with a question to Kent about what theoretical insights can we gain from other countries outside of the US, of course, where scholars have devoted much more attention to these processes. So for a comparativist like me, it is quite surprising that we are only just talking about democratic backsliding in the US today. In other parts of the world, we've been talking about this for a long while. So I wanted to ask you, Kent, what can we learn? What can the US learn from what has happened in other parts of the world?
Well, I think indeed, the theoretical insights are quite interesting. I want to kind of focus on some that I think are maybe the most relevant to the United States, given that we're kind of trying to put the U.S. in conversation with other countries. And so I think one of the main things we learned is that we simply can't understand subnational undemocratic behaviors without paying a lot of attention to the national government. And so even though we absolutely need to shift our attention to the subnational level and to do the kinds of empirical work that Professors Hill and Gallagher are doing, we can't forget about the center, right, at the national level. And so to really kind of problematize linkages or interactions between national and state governments. And so this could be things like the fiscal transfers I mentioned earlier. It could be, the role that upper chambers, the Senate plays in overrepresenting senators from undemocratic regimes at the subnational level. One of the key ways that subnational regimes in other parts of the world have survived is through the work that their senators do in Mexico City, in Buenos Aires, and at the national level. And so I think we can't forget the national level, and also the kind of, the reality that a lot of times subnational undemocratic regimes and authoritarian governors survive because they play really critical roles at the national level. They deliver voting blocks. And so there's often this sort of sense that democratically oriented politicians at the national level kind of look the other way because the work that the governors do in delivering voting bases is so critical. And that's the story of the Democratic Party in the United States under the New Deal, where FDR got the votes he needed to pass very progressive legislation because the Solid South, right? Because of these authoritarian governors in his own party. And again, I think Professor Giraudy has really shown us that we should not assume that the national government, when it is going to intervene, is going to intervene in a way that would generate democratic outcomes at the subnational level. And so I think the early literature kind of assumed, that if we see the survival of these undemocratic regimes at the subnational level, it's just because the national government is either feckless or incapable of, sort of imposing its democratic will on subnational governments. And I think we have a much more nuanced view now that in fact these behaviors at the subnational level can be functional to democratic politics at the national level. And then another thing that I think we've learned, and so in addition to this kind of vertical dimension between the states and the national government, we also need to pay attention to another vertical dimension between the states and the municipalities, kind of at a lower level, sort of digging down. And so there's a lot of variation in terms of how easily or not authoritarian governors can control the mayors and the municipalities within their jurisdictions. And so the US is like Argentina and Mexico, where municipalities have very little ability to withstand autocratic interventions by the state or provincial authorities. This has been referred to as sort of an authoritarian province, plural city dynamic, where you've got, the main opposition to authoritarian governors is coming from the more urban parts of the province, but that the municipalities don't have constitutional authority to really do much. And so Brazil is a really interesting exception here. We need to study it more, where the 1988 Constitution gave municipalities their own constitutional status separate from the states in which they're located. And so indeed, we see really interesting small d democratic alliances between Brazilian municipalities and the federal government that kind of sandwich or sort of circumvent the governors and sort of trying to erode authoritarianism kind of from above and from below. And so anyway, I think the walkaway is we need to think about multi-level governance and 3 tiers. Like, we can't just think about this as a 2-tiered problem. It's really 3 tiers. And then I think that the last thing that I would say is, and this kind of is related, that almost everything we know about undemocratic regimes in other parts of the world are coming out of federal cases and not unitary cases. And so on the one hand, federalism undeniably broadens the scope for undemocratic action. Federalism has been a shield for authoritarian governors. We obviously, that's what better example than the U.S. case under Jim Crow. And so the constitutional protections that federalism gives governors, it can be used for undemocratic ends, no doubt. It's also the case there's a lot of variation among federal systems. And so as I said, no federal system gives states control over federal elections in the way that the United States does. It's also the case that many federal countries have federal intervention rules where the federal government can intervene to dismiss an authoritarian governor. So federalism matters at the same time, and then on the other hand, that we need to broaden the kind of the scope beyond federalism. Most countries in the world are not federal. Overwhelming majorities are use unitary designs. And so I think this is the frontier of the kind of the research, to kind of think about how decentralization in unitary countries really across the global south have strengthened subnational governments, and this could be good or bad for democracy. And so if the mayor is going to use that authority to fight an authoritarian governor, then this can be a really positive development. But we shouldn't assume democratic behavior on the part of mayors. And we're seeing kind of these local, in Latin America, these local kind of caudillos, strong men and women who are occupying City Hall and behaving in really quite authoritarian ways, and may even have an easier time kind of getting away with it because they're at the municipal level and not at the provincial level, kind of, harder to kind of exercise oversight for a democratic action at the national level, kind of wanting to democratize, at the municipal level. So it could be positive or negative, for democracy, the strengthening of subnational governments. But I think the key point, the walk away here would be, and hopefully, many more people will now begin to kind of pick up some of what we've learned, hypotheses that have come out of federal cases, to think kind of more broadly in the great majority of countries that are unitary and likely to remain unitary in their design. So those are some insights that I think, really do suggest that we should be putting the United States in conversation with these other comparative cases.
Thank you so much, Kent, and thanks everyone. So I will now open it up for questions that we have already gotten. So I'll ask a few, I'll read them. The first one is for Charlotte Hill. It's coming from one of our PhD students. Do you see a future for the bottom-up counter-revolutions to be successful in terms of ensuring democracy? Or these acts will give a rationale to become even more authoritarian in order to control this mobilization further? So let me pick another one, maybe for Kent, from another participant. The question is about regional leaders. To what extent do we see a pushback in countries where regional and provincial political parties are different or mutually exclusive from national political parties? And this person refers to the case of India. In India's case, we see the national party, BJP, helming state governors and regional parties trying to stymie the BJP in their efforts to control their states. So there are pockets of resistance to the national level authoritarianism in states that are still democratic. So if you could reflect on that. So I'll stop with this too, and I'll come back if we have time, hopefully.
It's an interesting and really important question. Can these bottom-up counter-revolutions be successful in terms of ensuring democracy, or do they create a backlash that makes things even worse? To some extent, I think that depends on what the counter-revolution looks like and how much public support it receives. And we haven't spoken much in this conversation about the media environment. Maybe we can have another conversation sometime. I'm fascinated by what media environments look like in different countries and how that plays into political dynamics. But I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter protests and the George Floyd protests of a few years ago, and how, at least for a period of time, the protests received fairly widespread support from the public. I do think they created opportunities for more, small d and capital D democratic voices to be heard, and perhaps for people to actually win elections. I don't know. I haven't seen any data to support the idea that has pushed democracy in a more in a good direction in the U.S. So that policies have become more liberal in the criminal justice realm. I think you can actually point to some evidence that any short-term wins have kind of been eroded or reversed. And I'm out here in the Bay Area. We had Chesa Boudin and more progressive DAs who won and then have now lost their positions of authority. So I think the evidence there is kind of mixed, and the answer to that question might kind of depend on the time frame that you're looking at. And we've seen some short-term gains, and then in the long term, I'm not sure that we've seen much movement. I've looked at counter-mobilization in terms of, as I mentioned, suppression leading to voters counter-mobilizing and being able to overcome suppression efforts and turn out at high rates in elections. And that can certainly be important for maintaining an existing level of democratic access and participation. I'm skeptical that I haven't seen any evidence yet that the counter mobilizations on that front can lead groups to participate at higher levels than they previously had been participating. And I'm concerned. There was a meeting in the White House when some of the federal election reforms were being discussed in 2021, in which President Biden had said something to the effect of, like, we don't need to be all that concerned about voter ID laws, because we've seen that groups, that kind of grassroots voter mobilization groups, can effectively counter mobilize against them. And civil rights groups then came together, dozens, if not hundreds of groups came together and signed a letter that they sent to federal policymakers saying, like, that our work is not sustainable. You can't count on this backlash, counter mobilization effect to be sustained over the long term. And I actually beginning a new research project with a co-author at University of Massachusetts Amherst to survey civil rights groups and voter mobilization groups to understand what the impacts of some of these policies on their ability to organize and mobilize and pull in resources, and how sustainable they feel some of those efforts are. So anyway, I don't have a super clear answer on this front, but I'm certainly not hopeful. I'm not optimistic that we're going to be able to count that grassroots mobilization will get us out of the state that we're in. I look more toward systematic reforms to the electoral system, big picture reforms, things like adopting proportional representation in the United States, that are much harder to imagine happening, but I think may need to be adopted in order for us to ensure fair and equal participation across different groups.
Thank you. Kent, maybe in 2 minutes, can you tell us something about India?
I will, and I'm going to end on a positive note, which is, and this is such a great question to kind of think about, and I think the questioner puts their finger exactly on this fascinating dynamic where the BJP at the national level under Modi is clearly eroding democratic norms and institutions at the national level, and then the urgency of what's happening in some states where states, not governed by the BJP, but governed by opposition parties, trying to keep pluralism alive at the subnational level, to fight another day and to maybe kind of influence what's happening at the national level. And so I think that's absolutely an important dynamic. We saw it in Brazil under Bolsonaro, where he tried to erode democracy at the national level, did what he could in his 4 years to do that, and governors in opposition parties playing very valiant, important roles in trying to defend pluralism, defend Brazilian democracy writ large from their perch in as governors of important states. And so I think this is exactly right. And maybe some people more hopeful that the subnational dimension can serve this role for the broader political system, and then others kind of doubting maybe whether indeed hard to stand up to people like Modi and Bolsonaro with the leverage and the power that they have at the national level. So, but terrific question, I think.
Thank you. Well, thank you all of you for this fantastic conversation. It was too short, at least for me. I mean, I wish we had 1 more hour to talk about these issues. But I wanted to thank you very much for your time, your insights, and also thank all the participants who came to listen to all 3 of you who have shared amazing findings with all of us. So I hope that those of you who were not able to come to the conversation can watch the video, and we will make sure to share it with the participants here as well.